Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And today we head to Greece in 1941. An intriguing, I guess you'd call it a battle of wits between German armoured units and Australian and New Zealand troops in the mountains, valleys, and rivers of the country. Geoffrey Plowman's new book covers this campaign. It's, of course, in the description below. I urge you to go out and get this one, but I'll bring him in now. So it's morning here, evening there. Hiya, Jeff. How are you today?
Good evening, or yes, with me, good morning to you. So, yeah.
It's good. So, we were just talking, the Greek campaign gets a lot less attention than North Africa, than Sicily, than Italy. You know, you've researched New Zealand troops, Australian troops in different campaigns. Was it harder to look into this campaign, or was there lots of resources? I know from your slides, there's plenty of photos.
Well, I actually thought it was going to be very hard. As obviously, there's all the archival material which is online on the Australian War Memorial, all the unit diaries. The unit diaries in New Zealand. There's also records of the correspondence for the official histories, which you look at. The photographs is what I thought would be the hardest part, particularly from the Allied side, because I didn't think much in the way of cameras was carried over. But when you start digging around and talking to friends and looking at veterans, there's an amazing collection of photographs that we put together. And then the Germans, photographed everything and filmed everything, you know what I mean? So it's incredible. When I managed to contact a guy in Italy who had actually paid someone, I presume, to go into the National Archives in the US and found all the German official photographs. And he gave me 135 photographs of the Greek campaign alone. I mean,
I guess it's that time of the war when the Germans, things are generally going pretty well for them. So I suppose they've got more time to take photos, whereas later on in the war, the Allies have the more photographers and the Germans are struggling. But anyway, we're going into a rabbit hole of talking about archives. We're going to, that's the film for later on. So I'm going to hand over to Jeff to take us through this. Folks, I don't know how many questions there may or may not be, but there'll be plenty of information and plenty of maps. So I'm going to hand over to my guest. So over to you, sir.
Okay, next slide then. This is just a general introduction. I mean, why were Britain interested in Greece? I guess it can go right back to the 19th century when they helped the Turks, the Greeks against the Turks really, and gave them independence from them. But in the Second World War, there was this thing like Britain and France wanted to support Poland and obviously couldn't for various reasons. But they also wanted to support Greece as also a country under threat from Germany, from Italy potentially. The question was, how could they go about it? Britain had suffered quite heavily in the Battle of France, 1940, a lot of equipment lost. They were in the process of rebuilding their forces. And they had, in the Middle East, under General Archibald Wavell, a huge potential number of threats. Like Wavell wasn't just facing the Italians in Libya. There were French and Vichy French in Somalia, Italians in Somalia. There was issues in Iraq, Iran. There was the border with Syria with the Vichy French again. And so, Wavell was quite put upon, really. I mean, I had this fabulous campaign under Connor, which drove the Italians out of Cyrenaica. And then, come along and Winston wants to support Greece. And it was kind of like, this is a neighbor and so on like that. There was more to it than that, of course. I mean, Crete was quite a valuable island and a prize for both the Germans and the British because it was controlled over the Mediterranean Sea by air. But when Italy invaded Greece, Britain offered some help, but the Greeks were going like, well, you haven't got much to give us, and they knew that, and they would initially rejected their offer, and they continued to do so. And back when Britain, of course, then sent troops into Crete, and that really got annoyed Italy, basically, the fact that, Italy should have gone in there and taken that. And he always started to put plans in to take on Greece, but only as far as Salonika, from the port point of view, actually. But getting the Greeks to agree was difficult. And the negotiations, they wanted support, from Yugoslavia, and they wanted support from Turkey as well. And Yugoslavia was a divided nation with, Slovenia and Croatia, more pro-German, and Serbia and other places more pro-British, really. The Turks, on the other hand, wanted supplies from Britain, knew they couldn't get it because Britain was struggling, but also felt if they got involved with their weak army, the Russians had signed a pact with Germany, and the Russians were their enemy. So they could come around the back while they were fighting the British, in Greece, for example. So they kind of backed out too. And then, the attack stalled, so the British sent aircraft over to Greece and that. And finally, they offered when Metaxas died, there's a change of heart. And they offered, 2, 3 infantry divisions, an armoured brigade. Still wasn't enough for the Greeks, really. But in the end, they actually basically had to accept that. And then there was hassles over where they're going to deploy the troops. The Greeks wanted to maintain their lines in Bulgaria and Albania, and they wanted the British to send their troops up to Salonika, and the British didn't want to do that. So they compromised on this Aleakman line, which is just on below the Olympus mountain range, essentially. So if you go to the next slide, this is the force we got under. There was another problem too, of course. General Henry Maitland-Wilson was put in charge. Australian Imperial Force Commander, Lieutenant General Thomas Blamey, felt that he should have gone because the Australians and New Zealanders were the major component of the fighting troops. The Wavell argued that, well, we are supplying more than just that and support troops in the Air Force. So, but that was the idea: 2 Australian divisions, 1 New Zealand division, an armoured brigade. And the armoured brigade was pretty pawned away, a complete regiment of light tanks, almost out of date this time of the war. 3rd Royal Tanks had 52 A-10s, which had seen better days. Their tracks had 1,000 miles. They were pretty worn out. They needed a major engine overhaul. There were very few spare parts. In fact, they had started out when they got to the Middle East with 2 squadrons of A-13s, and Wavell pinched those and gave them these worn-out A-10s, So if you go to the next slide, what you're up against is essentially, this is the main fighting force that ended up in Greece, really. You have 40 Corps, Army Corps under George Stumm, 2 Panzer divisions, and Leibenstadt Adolf Hitler Brigade under Sepp Dietrich, and 30 Army Corps with 2 mounted divisions and 2 Panzer divisions, basically. So, a number of tanks you've got against this poor brigade with worn-out tanks is quite phenomenal, really. So we'll start off with initial dispositions. I've just got a series of slides to show you the thinking of the British at the time. And the idea was, I said, to initially have this Aleakman line. So they started off, the first unit was the 1st Armoured Brigade. They were up at Hesse near the top there. They put 3rd RTR, 3rd Royal Tanks, and basically further south. They said it was a reserve, but I think it was also because they realised the tanks would have not got very far. If they had to go to Hesse and back, they'd probably lose all the tanks to mechanical failures. They did lose all their tanks, one from mechanical failures in the end anyway. So next in was New Zealand Division. So next slide, they put a 4th Brigade just out south of the Aleakman River, and the 6th Brigade came up next to them. The original idea was there would be a Greek division between them in the Aegean Sea, but Freyberg discovered, General Freyberg, the New Zealand Division commander, that this division was only a brigade, a very weak brigade at that. So they moved them up into the area around Salonika, or Thessaloniki, we know it today. And we extended what was a 2-divisional front into 2 brigade front, which did, I'm probably looking at German war diaries, actually gave the impression there were 2 New Zealand divisions holding this line, essentially. So the next unit that came up was that of the 5th Brigade. They put that down in reserve in Olympus Pass. And then finally, there'll be another slide. They put the 16th Brigade. Now, this is the only Australian brigade that actually got to Greece before war started in Greece. And there's a story behind that too, because initially General Wavell wanted to send the 7th Division, who was based in Egypt, and just needed to re-equip them, get them up to strength and numbers and weapons and so on, and they could go. Blamey wanted to send the 6th Division, but the 6th Division was in Cyrenaica. And he said they had more battle experience, though that it's also felt in Australia that Blamey had intense dislike of the commander of 7th Division, which was a guy called Lieutenant General Laverack, Major General Laverack. So, and there's an argument that went on basically there, but in the end, Wavell said, okay, you can send the 6th Division, but you must replace it with another brigade, another division before you send it. So they had this really strange process where they took 1 brigade from the 9th Australian Division facing the Syrian border, moved it to Egypt, replaced a brigade from the 7th Division Egypt, sent it off to Cyrenaica, and then brought a brigade back from Cyrenaica to Egypt and sent it over. And they got caught up with sandstorms. There was the Battle of Matapan with the sea attack. There were storms. So this was the actual total sum of what we had. not 2 divisions of infantry, but 1 and a third, basically, actually, an armoured brigade.
Right.
But anyway, and then the other issue too is to note the positions too, because essentially what we have is a lot of all these units facing basically the attack from Bulgaria. Obviously, there's fighting going on in Albania too, but that was held out largely by the Greeks because of the mountain terrain. But there's an obvious problem here that if the Germans attack Yugoslavia, they could come down through a thing called the Monastir Gap, which is basically above the Third Royal tanks. The other gap was actually on the Aegean Sea, down south of Olympus Pass at Platamon Ridge. And there was seemed to be a feeling with Blamey, for example, that Platamon Ridge, Pineios Gorge was impregnable, that the Germans wouldn't come there, they couldn't get through there. This is despite the fact that this was a logical attack route being used centuries before by invaders from Greece, essentially. And that's why there's a castle on the ridge at Platamon Castle, so.
Well, the first 2 years of the war are full of occasions when the Germans attacked through areas the Allies should have guessed they were coming. I mean, that's kind of the story of the first 2 years, really, isn't it? And, the Ardennes and anyway, yeah, they adjust the line.
Yeah. And then there's Blamey wanted to move to cover them at the Monastir Gap, but Wilson didn't want to do that. I guess it may be political reasons actually, but in the end, when the actual invasion of Yugoslavia started, and Greece as well, and mainly around the Texas line, southeast of Thessaloniki, basically, and the mountains there, he agreed to start moving units around. So the first one was they moved the 1st Armoured Brigade back to what they call Clearly Pass. And this happened to coincide with the arrival of the first next 2 Australian battalions, the 2nd, 4th, and 2nd, 8th Battalion, which were rushed up from Athens. In fact, the 2nd, 8th Battalion arrived literally the evening the Germans started probing attacks on the line. They were digging in when they actually had to deal with this invasion, this incursion. And it might explain why the 2nd, 8th Battalion eventually broke and ran when the actual Germans broke through. That's not the story anyway. But the next move was to move 4th Brigade over to Serbia Pass. So the lake you can see there is actually the dammed Serbia, the Aliakman River, basically. And then they moved 6th Brigade into reserve, Elassum there, that position. They left the divisional cavalry basically holding the line of the Aliakman River. The final move was to bring 16th Brigade back to beside 4th Brigade. So that's the next slide.
All right, yep, done. Brilliant maps, by the way. Thank you.
So that's the kind of the final stage before the sort of serious fighting started, actually. So, the Germans came through. The 9th, the 2nd Panzer Division essentially came around right behind the Metaxas line. And the Germans actually overcame the Metaxas line, sort of the northern part of it, where it was not so strong. But the 2nd Panzer Division came through behind them and reached Salonika on the 9th of April, essentially cut off any Greek troops that were actually north of that region, northeast of that region, including the motorized brigade that was supposed to be, had been originally alongside the New Zealand Division, actually. And this was taken in Thessaloniki. It was easy to find. There's a very prominent mosque in a city very close to the sea. If you go to the next slide, you can see the mosque today. It's no longer a mosque, it was a restaurant, actually. Now they're going to turn it into a museum, apparently, So if we go to the next slide, at the same time as this attack happened, and they reached Thessaloniki, or Salonika, I should call it Salonika, really. There was the Divcav was based along the Aliakman River, and they were basically between 2 bridges. This road bridge near the town of Nisali, and the railway bridge further east. And they blew up the railway bridge. And they had to keep this bridge open because New Zealand did a deal with the 1st Armoured Brigade to lend them 2 troops of Marmot Heritage armed cars for reconnaissance. And the British lent them 7 A-13s from their brigade headquarters squadron, probably the most reliable tanks they had in Greece, actually. They went far further than anywhere the A-10s did, actually. So once they crossed the bridge on the 9th, the Divcav blew it up. Now, if you go to the next slide, in fact, the bridge is still there, though the Germans rebuilt the actual the southern part of the bridge. And when they pulled out in 1944, they blew up the northern part that the New Zealanders held. So part of that northern part of the bridge is probably the original bridge, actually. And part of that's the old bridge there. So that was basically it until they arrived. So essentially you have 2nd Panzer Division reaching Thessaloniki. You have Leibstandarte out of Hitler attacking Clearly Pass around that time. And they fought through to about the 13th of April. If you read Herman Bauch's book, Herman Bauch was commander of Panzer Regiment 3. And when they got to Thessaloniki, he was expecting to be resupplied within about 48 hours. Unfortunately for them, the Germans hadn't really anticipated how much more badly the roads were actually in bad condition they were in Greece and France, for example, or Poland. And I think it took them at least 4 days, maybe 5 days, to get enough supplies of petrol and ammunition through to the Germans to get to panzers working again. But there was enough petrol around to start reconnaissance, to start sending out troops towards the Aliakman River. So go to the next slide. Essentially, they set out probing attacks. They sent their Schutzen Regiment troops. They had they lent them 5 Panzer IIs from the 1st Battalion Panzer Regiment 3, a few armoured cars and anti-tank guns. They began a probe towards the divisional cavalry. And the divisional cavalry was basically just a holding pattern, really. They weren't supposed to stay there too long. But they gave them quite a bloody nose, actually. When they first attempted to cross the river, literally not a single assault boat survived, really. They'd made 2 or 3 assaults that evening before, and they got beaten back, actually. The following day, on the 13th, they continued their attacks. And essentially, by about midday, when they started moving towards the railway bridge and try and get across there, the Div Count decided it's time to pull out. And had an artillery, batteries with them as well, so they had additional support, really. At the same time, Leibstandarte out of Hitler, they eventually broke through Mackey Force. And these forces set up, but all these ad hoc forces, so Mackey was one of the commanders within the 6th Australian Division, basically.
You mentioned the reconnaissance and patrolling. I mean, at this time of the campaign, how much autonomy do the divisional commanders German have in terms of finding their own routes? Because we know as the war goes on, there's more and more kind of pressure pushed down from Hitler to do this. This is the exact definite objective. You've got to go via this road. In this part of the war, they can do more of their own interpretation of the battlefield as they do it. They've got reconnaissance. They might as well use it. Is that fair?
Yes. They're also limited by the condition of the roads.
Yeah.
Perhaps one of the worst roads was one between Sicily and Caterini, where the New Zealanders had base for a while. And in fact, they said they got to the point where their Opel Blitz trucks were literally dragging on their footboards through the mud, essentially. It caused major problems later on in terms of supply. And it cost them heavily in terms of supply, actually. You had to be totally reliant on your own, what you brought with you, essentially. You know what I mean? So,
right.
Yeah. So this is just some photographs from a 2nd Panzer Division book, and they put out the old Comrades Association showing, obviously, I suspect it's all, put on as an interesting, it was all as an act for the photographers rather than the actual assault, really, actually, but just crossing the river. Next photograph actually shows them bringing some of the panzers across, actually. This is a floating pontoon bridge. So they had a range of half tracks, and these tanks actually stayed with them all the way right down to Platamon. There's one point where they said, "Can we keep them?" And they said, "Yeah, fine," because they were that much further ahead, actually. So, and I also wondered, because they ran up against the divisional cavalry the following day at this anti-tank ditch that the actual Greeks in the building never quite completed. And I always wondered how the New Zealanders and armoured cars with 12.7 millimeter machine guns or anti-tank rifles could deal against a German tank. But they were dealing with Panzer IIs with essentially just a 20 mil cannon, not much better than what they had, actually, except the anti-tank rifles they found later just wouldn't penetrate the frontal armour of the tank, because the Germans had up-armoured all their tanks after the Polish campaign, realising how important that was, actually. So next slide. So then, essentially, they pulled back. The Schutzen Regiment, 2nd Section Regiment, pulled right down, got as far as Caterini. At the same time, Leibstandarte Standarte, Adolf Hitler, basically were ordered off to the west, and 9th Panzer Division came through and broke through the lines and essentially drove them all the way back. The two remnant battalions from 19th Brigade, the 2nd, 4th and 2nd, 8th Battalion were put in beside the New Zealand at Serbia Pass, and that left the 3rd Armoured Brigade pulling back south of the river, essentially. They were aiming to get to a place called, I can't remember. Anyway, I'll come back in a minute. But anyway, that was the sort of next stage of the movement, really. If we go to the next, that's Gravena. They end up in a place called Gravena. So 9th Panzer Division essentially pushed on down south in the direction of Serbia Pass, the idea of making a breakthrough there. On the 14th, they sent the 2nd Kradschutzen Battalion from 2 Panzer Division down to Platamon as a reconnaissance element again, with the panzers with them, actually. At this stage, it has to be said that, go back a slide, just to show you how far behind. Now this is 2 Panzer Divisions actually got to Sicily at this stage, and Panzer Regiment 3 has finally got moving. But there's the whole regiment, about 150 odd tanks, is largely that far back. And that's largely, as I say, because of the resupply problem, essentially. But at this point, they decided, the commander of 2nd Panzer Division, decided to split the 2nd Panzer into 2 battle groups. One under Hermann Baut, which was sent south to Platamon, and the advanced element is the Kradschutzen Battalion, and the second was set off towards Olympus Pass. And the interesting thing about this is, as you say, how unprepared we were for dealing with, the Germans' ability to go places not expected of them. We were saying we sent troops down we put 21st Panzer Division down at Platamon. They had they had a troop of 4 25-pounders, some engineers to blow up the tunnel, and some anti-tank mines. The anti-tank mines they actually acquired in England. They were supposed to give them back after the 5th Brigade before return to Egypt, the 2nd echelon, but the engineers kept them, and I'm not sure the British didn't mind too much, but as typical New Zealanders, they're always good at pinching things from time to time. So that was up against them. Freiburg actually came down on the 14th to talk to 21st Battalion and said, look, you haven't got any tank guns, you're not going to expect tanks, so don't worry about it, basically, And the first thing they saw that evening as this force arrived, apart from a few motorcycles, was in the war diary, said, well, there was a small tank. Clearly it was a Panzer II. And the following morning, they also reported on the radio messages they had seen 5 tanks. So once again, this would be the platoon of tanks that have been attached to the advanced force, really, actually. And in the meantime, 9th Panzer Division is still heading towards Serbia Pass. Now you've got 1st Armoured Brigade back at Gravena. And now they're getting worried because they're thinking, well, we need some more backup forces for the 1st Armoured. They were losing tanks like crazy. By the time they got to Gravena, they had 7 A-10s left. And only one was lost to enemy action at Clearly Pass. The rest all broke down through tracks, engine, transmission failure, you guessed it. So they decided to have another ad hoc force under Brigadier Stanley Savage called Savage Force. They had 2 battalions of infantry. They had several, company of anti-tank guns, an artillery regiment, and they gave them the 7 A-13 tanks from the Brigadier Headquarters Squadron. The one must have broken down, so they only had 6 at that stage, but they still had quite a powerful force there. At this stage, there was still no real concern about 21st Battalion, even though there was a chance of a major attack coming up towards Olympus Pass now. And at this point, Freiburg said, look, I've got a major attack facing. If you go to the next slide, I think you'll see that. That's Platamon Castle. So this is kind of the view from the castle. This was the main sort of defense point of the New Zealanders. And you have this incredible view right up the valley towards Katerini, actually, along the coast. These days, if you go to the next photograph, you can't stand on top of the keep of the castle, not allowed, but even when you stand on the walls, you can still get quite a good view of what the guys had, actually. So
brilliant.
And I just thought I'd set out, this is the situation on the morning of 15th of April, 21st Battalion, the balance of power lay very much in their court, basically. They had more light machine guns. They had less mortars, but they had 425 pounders and anti-tank rifles. So the Germans did have these 5 Panzer IIs. The trouble was the Germans found that the Panzer IIs, they tried to push them up the hill in the attack, and most of them through tracks. They essentially had abandoned them at that sort of day, essentially. So that wasn't a particularly effective use of the tanks, really. The next slide. So this is the defences of the castle. Essentially, they had A Company around the castle, B Company around a sort of distinctive feature called point 266, a 2 double hill, basically. D Company was a reserve. They also put C Company, it's about a mile away, a couple of kilometres away on a hill overlooking the thing. That sort of extended their front out, really. I'm not quite sure why they did that, because they're quite well separated from the rest, actually. And the main tank was on A Company, really, with some towards B Company sort of stuff. There's a major town here now, Pantelimonis, Neos Pantelimonis here, but in those days it was just a few houses. The town that C Company was also Pantelimonis, but old Pantelimonis, basically. So they basically had a fight there. It didn't achieve very much. As I say, then this is the 15th of April. While this battle's going on against the 21st Battalion, you've got Kampfgruppe Kurlitz. He's the other commander. Kurlitz was the commander of the Panzer Grenadier Regiment, or the infantry regiment, basically. And Bout was in terms of the tanks itself. At the same time, on the 15th, you're having 9th Panzer Division attack 4th Brigade, and that didn't go very well. They couldn't get tanks across the river. One of them actually, they tried to get across that night, and it got washed away in the stream, and the bridge collapsed. The guys went in, they sent some troops in that morning, and they walked into a trap, basically. The New Zealanders waited till they took up positions and then basically mowed them down and forced them back to the town of Serbia, essentially. So if we go to the next one now. And so on the 15th of April, we have a change. You've now got, Kampfgruppe Balk have arrived that afternoon. They brought with them about 54 tanks plus the 5 that were already there. You also have moves to send the 6th Gebirgs Division, the 6th Mountain Division, through the hills. The idea was to get behind the New Zealanders at Pineios Gorge and cut off any sort of retreat that way. They did launch some attacks that afternoon. Once again, they had great difficulty with tanks working on the hills, essentially. Quite a few, then again, through tracks, had to give up when they got close to the thing. They were very lucky there were no tank guns there at the time. And then some attacks continued on that night. So this is getting to an interesting situation, really, because Aliakman River, this is just showing the tanks crossing on the 15th of April. And it's interesting to note the Corduroy Road on this side. There probably one was on the other side too, which points to the fact that the actual bridge was downstream of the old bridge that was destroyed, really, and also shows the state of the country they're working in, really. The Divisional Cavalry said, when you get rain in Greece, the roads just turn to quagmire and mud, and it's just difficult to move, really, actually. So next slide. So this is just showing the journey down of 2nd Panzer Regiment, the Balks, and he had a battalion of tanks. The 1st Battalion, the 2nd Battalion was with Kampfgruppe Kurlitz. He had essentially 2 infantry regiments in the end, but mainly the first one came down was 504 Infantry Grenadier Regiment. And this is interesting because there's a half track got stuck in the stream, and this Panzer III is trying to pull it out, basically. So go to the next slide. You can see the railway bridge above, driving underneath it. And they couldn't use these bridges. The Greeks had this peculiar thing of there was not the culverts we're used to with proper concrete bridges that you can walk over. They were just railway lines strung across a gap in the river. And you would not be able to get, with just the sleepers attached, you couldn't get tanks across or vehicles across. The New Zealanders actually found some spare railway sleepers. You can see the metal sleepers on the side of the road there, the side of the thing. And they would use those as like channels to get their their gun tractors across, So, but you couldn't do it with the tanks. The tanks would literally turn into a tank track and be stuck on the bridge, actually. So The next slide. This is when they finally sort of came out into the open area itself. The next slide, we're looking at Platamon Castle itself, and the fire is probably New Zealand fire on the German positions down below, basically. So they basically held them off quite well. And this is the balance of power. So you can see how it's changed. Now you've got 25 Panzer IIs, 24 Panzer IIIs, 10 Panzer IVs. Potentially, you may have a few losses through breakdowns or mechanical failures of some sort, but potentially you're talking about 59 tanks there. A huge range of light machine guns and heavy machine guns, more mortars, 75mm mortars, 150mm mortars, 105mm guns, anti-tank guns, 50mm and 37mm. It's a huge difference in terms of power balance, basically. But the terrain favoured the New Zealand essentially because it was a good tank country, really. There was a track that led down on the south side of Platamon Ridge to the railway line. I think that's to supply people of the town to go down to the railway line and pick up bits and pieces like that. But most of that was cross-country running. So the main attack happened the next morning. But before we get into that, the response of the whole Anzacs was quite strange. By this stage, we've actually had Blamey has taken command of the New Zealand Division and the 6th Australian Division, and it's called Anzac Corps. And they're getting, Freiberger said, look, I can't look after the 21st Battalion when I'm doing the major attack in Olympus Pass. Would you look after 21st Battalion? So they were passing on radio messages to Blamey's headquarters through the day. And they were hearing more and more about the fighting, and they were getting messages by that late afternoon that I could see 25 tanks. At one point, I think the commander of 21st Battalion, Neil Mackey, basically went over the top and thought he's 150 tanks. But when you've got a lot of the fog of war and half tracks and everything else down there as well, it's probably hard to distinguish friend from foe. But despite all this information getting through, there's no response from Blamey. In fact, Blamey's plan is to pull out the remnants of the 19th Australian Brigade and get them back out to they're talking of pulling back to Thermopylae Pass as the next main defensive line, get them out because they've suffered the worst. And then they're going to pull out the 16th Brigade, which would come through and join the 4th Brigade at Surrey Pass. And so the blocking group between Larissa, which is the main junction point down south, and Savage Force. And yet there's no talk of reinforcing 21st Battalion, despite the fact there are tanks here. And there's no evidence of any tanks or anybody moving in the direction of Savage Force. The 5th Panzer Division essentially took over that evening from 9th Panzer Division, but they didn't start moving in the direction of Gravina and Savage Force until the following day, essentially. They managed to get across the river, and the 9th Panzer Division just stayed where they were at that point in time. And so the decision was made that night, not by Blamey, but by his Chief of Staff, Brigadier Sydney Rowell, to send over an officer, a brigadier closed, to go and visit 21st Battalion and find out what's going on. And he's going to send him over in a 2-wheel drive staff car. No one had any idea how to get there, whether the roads were suitable, what route to take. And they had no other instructions just to find out what's going on. And to think, if this was the German army, this is the thing about the German army, is that when there's a problem, they just see what troops we've got, we'll send them here and we'll sort it out. Yeah. But where they have played this waiting game, and instead of sending, 15th, 16th Brigade to here to provide support, and Freiberger said, if this position could be held by a battalion for 24 hours, but they need support after that. And this is already 24 hours have gone by, and there's no sign of support, And actually, Close had to go to Freiberger's headquarters to find out, well, how do I get there? And Freiberger said, well, your best thing to do is to go by train. Of course, by this stage, the Greek army is in full retreat, and they've been pulling out units, and in fact, one of the Australian battalions arrived in Larissa that night on a train, an expectation to be sent through to Savage Force, gave up their train. The Greeks stole the train and headed off to Athens. There were a few jiggers floating around. They pulled the jiggers. So by the time Close gets down the following morning, the 16th of April, there's no trains, nothing left in the railway station yards. In fact, the Australians, when they were assembling the last train to escape themselves, because they wanted to go back further south, they started a fire in one of the trains in the far corner of the yard, and they went off and let the Germans bomb that part of the yard because they saw the flames burning up in the train, essentially.
Wow.
So,
crazy story.
Yeah, and then Close goes through, and he carries on the staff car, finally comes to the 21st Battalion, transport unit, and says, they said, well, you're not going to get very far in that car. We'll lend you one of our trucks, so. And, in the meantime, there's an attack developing here. The main attack is actually the first company of tanks with Panzer IIIs with an infantry company attacking up these valleys towards the summit between point 266 and Platamon Castle. The second attack was second company of tanks. It's like a feint attack, really, just to draw attention away from the main attack, essentially. That didn't work out terribly well either. The next photograph will show why. This is a Panzer III that just ran off its tracks. So you can see the railway line and you can see the sea just beyond the railway line, the beach and everything else. So, and I suspect that attack, they weren't going to push that one very hard anyway. So, and they gave up on that. Things didn't go well either with the first company attack, if you go to the next photograph, because this is the company commander's attack, a guy called von Boxberg. And you can see this blowing a mine off the tracks, basically. And I think this one actually, this has been abandoned well after, so it was more than just a mine damage and more serious, I think. And you can go there now, and this is a local beekeeper has a road that goes down near the castle on the old main roads. And that's the view of the castle from there, you see. So anyway, they decided to put another attack. They were holding out quite well at this point, but then third company joined in with their Panzer IVs, and that was enough to unsettle Mackie and the 21st Battalion, really. And by 10 o'clock, they decided to pull out, but they didn't do too well either because it was quite heavily mined. So if you go to the next photograph, here's one. This is quite a well-known photograph published in Signal magazine of one of the tanks hitting a mine and all the crew getting out. It was fairly minor. I think it just took a track off or something like that. But if you go to the next photograph, this one caught fire next to a Panzer III. The obviously got stuck in the thing. Fire got more and more intense. And at some point, the whole turret literally blew off, the whole turret and the upper superstructure as well. So another loss they had, if you go to the next photograph, this Panzer IV suffered more than just track damage. It blew off the cover over the transmission housing, essentially. So this tank is photographed quite a lot with horses going past and trucks going past. So it was a fairly major recovery effort. Probably had to wait till they get it back to Germany to do a repair, actually. Once again, the castle positions, you can match that quite well. And it does place it very, very close to the summit of the not the summit, but the actual, the saddle between the two Platamon Castle and point 266.
Yeah.
So this really unsettled in itself. And so I'm just taking a break from the whole thing because there's this famous photograph of Hermann Bauck on his command tank. It's a command tank because he's actually one of the guns as a dummy, actually, machine gun. Right. The main gun's a dummy as well, and the radio area on the back, and the other command tanks behind it. So, and who was this soldier? Some people said it was New Zealander, some said it was a British, but it's more likely to be British or Australia because they weren't any British soldiers anywhere in this area where Hermann Bauck fought. They only really fought at Platamon Castle and Pineios Gorge, really. So, but the next photograph was the one that was quite the killer, really. Originally, I saw a photograph. Most photographs just show this guy in the tank, and the background is very much obscured. There's a photograph on the back of a Signal magazine which showed the hill, which caused a lot of debate when it first appeared. And some thought it was Mount Ossa, but it wasn't. And I finally tracked down this photograph in Buddha's archive and recognized that immediately as 0.266. The highest point is 0.266. And this actually is the hill in the background, you can see. And there's a little gully that runs up, and it's hidden by another small ridge. So the tanks actually were able to use a gully, and they came out of this gully and must have caught New Zealanders by surprise when all this happened. But the question was, who was this guy? So I wrote to the, I thought the best place, 21st Battalion, Auckland Unit, North Military District. I write the Auckland Herald, New Zealand Herald about this, actually. And I thought they would just stick it in their letters to the editor column, and next minute this report rings me up and says, oh, I'm being asked to write a piece on this, So we did this, got published on a Saturday paper. I had all sorts of people ring up to think it was their father. Mostly they were people from 24th Battalion but their father had got captured in the Peloponnese, and one guy spent 3 days on the run, and so it couldn't be them actually. And one guy finally said, yeah, I know this, my uncle knew this person, I have some photographs of him. And then eventually we got contact from his granddaughter, which is the next piece actually, and that's his granddaughter with the photograph. Turns out this photograph, Germans being Germans, and the Americans weren't at war at this stage, must have wired it back to Berlin. The Berlin people wired it to New York. New York they knew it New Zealanders, so they wired it through to Auckland, and they published it in the paper. So somebody's son, and of course the guy's wife recognized it. So not only did it appear in Signal magazine, but there was another Stuttgarter magazine that came out, another magazine, where it was on the front cover. And the day that he got released from prisoner of war camp, one of the guards gave him the front cover of the magazine, so there you are, that sort of stuff, And they were delighted. They thought he got captured in Crete. So to actually know exactly where he got captured and how. And even more, the question is, why was he on the tank? Well, I still don't understand that question, why. But apparently it turns out when they came under fire that morning, a mortar bomb landed quite close to his slit trench, killed all guys with the mortar bomb, totally buried him. He was totally covered in rubble. All the Germans found when they came up there was his hand sticking out. So they dug him out, right? And I guess they figured, let's make something of this, actually, So.
And what was his name?
What's that?
What was his name?
I forget now, actually.
Sorry to put you on the spot. No worries.
Yeah, I forget. I'm not good at names sometimes, anyway.
No worries.
So we go down the next. So the Germans basically didn't do much for the rest of the day, essentially, on the 16th. They had to clear all the mines off the track. They actually were quite hungry too. Their food was running short, and there's lots of food left behind by the New Zealanders. That allowed the 21st Battalion to get back to Pineios Gorge, where they met up with Close. And Brigadier Close sort of said, well, they were going to pull out and escape. And he said, no, you have to stay. You have to defend the gorge. And you have to defend it to extinction if necessary, actually. And his parting shot was to say, well, I don't know if there's going to be reinforcements sent or not, but when I get back, I'll make sure it happens, which isn't the most encouraging thing you can tell somebody who's got 425 pounders with no ammunition and just fought odd Germans and abandoned all their radios and other bits of gear, actually, and anti-tank rifles that won't penetrate the front line of the tanks, even the sidearm of the tanks as well, So anyway, but that does put things in movement. But it didn't quite happen like that either, because on the morning of the 17th, Blamey didn't decide to send 16th Brigade to support them. He decided he was still going to carry on with his plans of going to between Larissa and Savage Force. And it was his chief of staff, Sydney Rowell, who said, we've got to help these guys out. So he got hold of, and he said, I'm going to send 2nd Battalion for the 16th Brigade over. There's a huge fight with him and Blamey, but he won, and then Blamey let him do it. But even when they got out there, the commander goes and talks to the headquarters and says, you're going over to Pineios Gorge to defend the area. But the battalion, in the meantime, had been ordered to go carry on to the original position between Larissa and Savage Force. And only when the commander got back and said, we are going to Pineios Gorge, he did that. He managed to get hold of the carry platoon who were already on the way to the other position to get them out, So they took up position, second battalion behind 21st Battalion. 2nd, 3rd Battalion also came out next. They had trouble finding 2nd, 1st. But they were also had to be told new direction. They were ordered to go to the old position. They were there. No, you have to go to Pineios Gorge. And then the commander of that, Lieutenant Colonel Ladd, had to stand at this crossroads with these different parts of the battalion were coming back and order them onto the new position. But they forgot about the fact that there were 3 platoons who had to wait for transport to pull them out. So when they got out, there was no one, anybody to tell them where to go. So 2 of the platoons went to their position. They were supposed to go on the road to Savage Force and decided, oh, there's no one here. Maybe they've gone back to Demokos and back down to the pass, next pass down. So they head off down there and disappeared. The last platoon came out and went to the same position again, no one there. They set off for Demokos through Larissa, headed south. Luckily, their commander realised what was going on, raced down, caught up with them, and redirected them, sent them back to the new position. And as I say, this is the sort of confusion that was going on. I don't know why this happened, and it was just complete chaos. And nothing that I thought would have really happened. Even 22nd 1st Battalion came out. They were supposed to go to man the airfield and defend that against paratroopers. They also went to the same position between Savage Force and Larissa until they got their orders to go to the airfield. And they were given a whole regiment of artillery and 620 guns as well. But they didn't even bother to prepare the airfield. They sort of parked up there and waited sort of stuff. So, but in the meantime, you've now got the 17th Camp Group Bout starts to move south. They're told, of course, what you've got in your supplies is that we can't get supplies to you from 2nd Panzer Division and Katerini. And Katerini, they can't even get supplies to 2nd Panzer Division further north because the road between Katerini and Sicily is completely trashed now. They have to start to do some major work. They said, you're on your own, you do it. So whatever petrol these guys have got, they've got to make the most of it, really. And the Gamurks division is meanwhile working over the hills to get behind the position too.
Right.
So if we go to the next slides, you'll see this is the tunnel we blew up. So this was a major problem. The engineers blew this tunnel, and they said didn't have enough explosive. They didn't think did a good enough job. But this tunnel constantly denied the Germans access to the transport. Really, they got it open for a couple of hours on the 18th, and then the whole wall collapsed on the top again. They had to start going again. So they had to basically use a saddle route to go over. It wasn't the best route they could use, but eventually they did get to use it. And that's the northern tunnel you can see now, entrance. There's a sign there that says there's a cafe on the other side. They extended the tunnel after the war to deal with rockfalls, and when they removed the old single line track railway and got a double track system, somebody bought the tunnel and turned it into a cafe. And it gets called the Galleria. And they use part of the railway line. You can see part of the old railway line still there. One of the old carriages they use as toilets. It's quite an amazing sight, actually.
Well, at least it's preserved. At least it's easy to find. Brilliant.
That's right. So can we get that one? It seems to.
What do you want? Sorry.
Oh, it didn't get the whole image actually. So yeah.
Oh, it must have just moved somehow. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So this is one of the famous photographs you'll see of the tanks moving south, essentially, along the railway line. The railway line is still there today, and crossing on the bridges. So if you go to the next slide, that's better. That bridge is still there, though you can't get quite the same look down on the bridge for the year before. The road south was pretty bad. They were having trouble. They couldn't follow the railway line, so they went inland. They had to basically start trashing fences and houses to build a corduroy road to get the tanks and vehicles over it, especially the wheeled vehicles. They eventually got down to Pineios Gorge itself. Next slide. So this was taken afterwards. They were expecting to find a bridge. The maps indicated there was a bridge across the river, and you can see the abutment on the south side.
Yeah.
So clearly there was no bridge there at all, actually. I believe there's an abutment on the north side still there, but just getting access to it, because you've got to cross this double track line to get to it, sort of thing. So no one's been successful. That feature in the background, that hill, is very, very distinctive.
Yeah.
That's the modern road going through, essentially. So, and when they got to the gorge, they tried to find a way across. It's not clear from the diary, but Bout just ordered the entire column into the gorge. So not knowing what they were going to find, right? So if you go to the next photograph, this is one of their STKs 251. This is an ambulance vehicle, so it's one of the ambulance vehicle with the Panzer Regiment 3. This is the first tunnel you come to, actually. If you go to the next slide, this tunnel doesn't exist now because after the war, the Greeks decided to blast a tunnel right through the hill behind the other two tunnels, because I guess once it gets rockfall, they built this portal on the western side too, to deal with rocks again, essentially. So, but when they went on further, they came to the second tunnel, next slide, and they found they couldn't go any further. Once again, the engineers had used all the explosives to destroy the tunnel and Platamon Ridge, and they had any explosives here. Across outside the road, they started digging craters or holes to make blasts and craters in the road. But here they found some explosives in a rubber worker's shed. So they blew the tracks up underneath on both sides. But before they did that, they dragged a rubber wagon through the middle of the tunnel and blew the undercarriage off. But very, very effective. There's no way you get tanks across here at all, actually. So this is the bicycle. This is actually a bicycle company from the 6th Gebirgs Division. They had a reconnaissance unit, a bicycle company, a horse company, and they were really struggling to get over the actual ridge with their horses and bikes. So they were diverted to join up with Balk's division, Balk's units, basically to fight on. And this tunnel still exists. If you go to the next slide, the railway track's been taken away now. Very hard to get an exact angle, but they're still there. The third tunnel's still there, but partly blocked by the new tunnel, essentially. So next slide. But now you've got a whole panzer regiment, 59 tanks. You've got armoured cars, half-track personnel carriers from the Grenadier Regiment. In the background, you'll see the railway shed, the railway, I guess it's a railway station of some sort, because just beyond here is a church with a grotto and a source of water, which is believed to have healing powers. People believe it heals sight and everything else like that. So it's much of a pilgrimage place for people, actually. So that's still there. That would obviously be the once where they used to travel before the road went through. And you go to the next slide, and this is what happened. All these tanks are spaced out at the right interval for air attack, so they don't get attacked by air. And if you go to the next slide, the column went right out beyond the gorge onto the western side. You can see a Panzer IV from the 3rd Company parked behind this artillery unit. So they basically had to wait. And what do? You got two choices. Do you pull the entire column out and try and cross the river at the eastern end, or do you find a crossing in the river? And your petrol supplies are limited. The chances are you might not get to Larissa at the end of the day if you did that, you see. So if you go to the next slide, they first had to get down from the railway line. There's quite a drop from the railway line normally down to the right, but they were lucky near this church because there's quite a bit of a flat area of land above the river where you can at least bring the tanks down. This tank's descending at quite a steep angle, and you can see 2 guys behind him on the right watching. I guess they'd have the driver and the commander, and hope the commander doesn't get killed, actually, if they rolled over. But the rest of the crew weren't going to wear it, really. But that's what they had to go to get across. And essentially 2 men waded upstream to find a route to actually go. And it was quite a way upstream too. I reckon about 200 meters, essentially. And then they sent a Panzer II up, and this Panzer II waded up the stream, got up the other side and fine. So then they decided to say, well, that's the route we have to follow, right? And they say that the infantry crossed over in K-pop rafts, K-pop floats, but some of the guys decided we don't want to do that. We're going to go on the tanks, basically. We'll take our chances, If you go to the next slide, that's kind of the crossing point. It's very hard to determine crossing points of vegetation these days, but essentially looking downstream from that point, really. And these days, because the road goes through, there's a car park, there's a swing bridge across the river to get to the actual church, and even a cafe. Now, the cafe, I think, is closed down. So closed down, I think, after the COVID-19. Next slide will show you a typical tank working its way upstream. And if you look behind it, you'll see another tank in the waters, probably a Mark II. And beyond that, you might be able to pick it out, there's also another tank trying to get into the river. And the next slide, this was taken upstream of the swing bridge, which you can just see the distance. Quite a while, and I've often wondered whether a friend of mine suggested, was that, sandbar, that shingle bar there during the war, because that tank sort of comes out of the water a bit once it gets closer to where you take the photograph, actually. And the church is just across outside the river, actually. You know.
This reminds me of those old westerns when the cavalry are trying to cross the Rio Grande or something like that. This is a modern army having to kind of go basic, just literally find a place to wade across a river. It's extraordinary.
The other thing is, if you look at the map, and everyone says the Germans found a ford on the river, and to me a ford is somewhere where you go on the river one side and cross out the other side, right?
Yeah.
But you don't. A ford is not something you drive 200 meters upstream to find a way out, if you know what I mean. You know?
No.
And I think this is what probably fooled the Anzacs in a way, the belief that the river was unfordable. I mean, you wouldn't expect to be able to cross a river in a gorge in springtime when it's high water, you know, and they probably thought that was safe, you know. And
yeah, I mean, that photo there, that show, this isn't just a few inches of water. This is that the current looks pretty strong there.
No.
That would be pretty hairy riding on the back of any vehicle going across that.
Yeah, and that tank, they never recovered that after the battle. That stayed there for quite a few days. It was quite a popular one to photograph when people went through and their little tourist type stuff, actually. You know, so if you go to the next slide, there's 3 of them in the river. In fact, the German records indicate they lost 3 Panzer IIs and 1 Panzer III in the river, but there's actually 2 Panzer IIIs in the river, and you can see and 1 Panzer II just behind the just in front of that other tank, the Panzer III in the far distance, and you can see on the cross side of the river, you can see the railway embankment just before the second tunnel. Yeah, so whether they recovered 2 of the Panzer IIs and actually lost 5 tanks, it's not quite clear to me, but it's certainly, you know, the Germans are fairly precise usually in terms of the records. But anyway, it's just an interesting story. But that's the same view. You can just make out the tunnel. It's really hard to see. You get to know where it is, but it's virtually on the extreme left, actually, before you get to all those bushes and trees, actually. So, but this is where those tanks would have come to grief, really, actually. So,
brilliant.
So this is the situation on the 18th. You've now got, so what they did, they managed to get 5 tanks across the river because they'd blown the 2 craters in the road, and they had a platoon there for a while to guard it, but they could actually hear, they would have heard the actual tanks crossing, but they thought they were infantry were crossing, possibly motorized boats, because no one suspected there were tanks over there. And eventually they pulled the platoon out because it was about midnight. They were kind of worried that the infantry who'd crossed the river would start getting behind and capture the platoon, really. And really, what could this platoon do with anti-tank rifle against tanks anyway? I mean, that defies logic, really. But in the meantime, the Gebirgs division start crossing over. They get in, they start coming over the mountain and start appearing the following morning and begin. And their job is to provide a sort of diversionary attack to try and draw the attention away from the main attack in the river, and in the meantime allow the Germans time, the Panzer Division time, to actually fill in those craters and get going. And so what happened there, the commander of the company, a guy Mickley, he ordered 2 platoons across, one fully equipped with weapons and one with spades and pickaxes to fill the holes in. And when they were finished, they had to go back and get their weapons, you know. And the other platoon, why they didn't bring their weapons with them, I don't know to this day, really, but it doesn't quite make sense. So that's a question for somebody, Ross Cable?
No, just saying how the benefit of visiting the ground. Ross Cable adding his comments there. Fellow Anzac, Ross is Australian, but yeah, amazing photos, amazing story.
So they held them off quite well most of that morning, actually. Australians and New Zealanders worked quite well together. Because they were command of the heights looking over the valley. The motorcycle company, or the cycle company, couldn't really advance much beyond the tunnel. But when the tanks showed up about midday, just after midday, all hell broke loose, and there was no way that infantry could deal with them. The first thing happened, B Company was the first that came under attack, and they started to pull up the ridge. And then C Company, most of them pull up the ridge too. The Australians saw this. This is the source of a lot of angst between Australia and New Zealand, that they saw them going, oh, they've given up, you know, they're running away, you know. There's one platoon, 13 platoon at the bottom of this ridge behind this anti-tank gun that stayed. They couldn't couldn't escape. There's no way they could get away. And they just dug in. 3 of the guys ran away and pulled out, but the other 20 guys stayed. And 3 tanks pulled up in front of them and started shooting at them. And they said they weren't very effective because they were too close. And I suspect that they were the shells would be fully a flat trajectory, actually, and they'd either go right over the top of them or on the bottom, And anyway, we know from the tanks that came up against the 3 of them, one was a command tank with a dummy gun and a machine gun. One was probably a Panzer II, and one was a Panzer III. So they weren't that effective anyway, And these guys held out. We don't know how long. It could be as long as an hour until the other 2 tanks dealt with the 2 companies, basically. Eventually, one of the tanks went round to where the Australians had blown 2 craters in the road to block them, and they were eventually joined by the other 2 tanks. And they started to work their way around this blown craters, actually, there. And the anti-tank gunner, Kavanagh, Sergeant Kavanagh, in charge of this gun. This photograph came from the 2nd Panzer Division book, and they said it was taken in Platamon, but there were no anti-tank guns in Platamon, so we know where it was located. I can show you why we know that in a minute. And Kavanagh just sat there and they just watched as these tanks negotiated this obstacle one by one. When they got to the end of it, they'd get out of their tanks and just wait, and the next tank came up and they got out and waited. Finally, the last tank crossed over, and then they started getting the tanks, and Kavanagh opened up, knocked out 2 tanks, set both of them on fire, and then got into engagement with the 3rd tank, and they couldn't knock it out. Did some damage, but I don't think the tank did much more after that, really, actually. But eventually the platoon, the infantry came over the ridge behind the Germans, behind the 13th platoon, and captured them. And when Kavanagh's guys saw that, they just decided to get out, really, actually. So to go to the next photograph, there's a very distinctive, see the distinctive ridge, those 2 peaks of distance?
Yep.
That's how we know the location. This was actually basically the spur occupied by 13th Company, obviously cut down by roads now, and there's now a double 2 4-lane highway basically going through a tunnel, actually. And this photograph, next photographs also, is one I always wondered about. There's the same hills, right? This is a tank from, it's a number 122. It was actually photographed earlier on from the 1st Company. So this was the ones that it was 1st Company that did the initial attacking from out of the gorge, because they were basically going in order: 1st Company, 2nd Company, 3rd Company, and the whole thing. The Germans were quite religious in terms of their zeal.
Quite German about it, yeah.
So, and it looks like it's must have got burned out because you can't see number 1. So I suspect it caught fire, but it was so it's probably one of the ones that Kavanagh got. But anyway, they managed to get the fire put out. They called out 4 more tanks, and there's 2 anti-tank guns line up, one over by the village of Tempe, one between Tempe and Kavanagh's gun, and these 3 tanks set off. In the meantime, the infantry had got going, the bicycle company, and they managed to cross the river by the blown bridge that the engineers had blown and take the village of Tempe. And these 4 tanks set off. And this was a case of, a British mistake of penny packets, distribution of tanks. These 4 tanks set off. 3 of them got knocked out. The last one got into Tempe about 3:30 p.m. And Mickley, the commander of the company, got a Knight's Cross, for attacking one of the anti-tank guns and capturing it. And I think it's probably the gun between Kavanagh's and one at Tempe, because the other one was knocked out by the tank. So this is 3:30, right? About eventually joins up with the leading units and that. But they still got to get the rest of the tanks over the river. They're still bringing 2nd Company tanks over. It takes until 4:30 to bring the tanks over from the river. If you go to the next slide, there's this is a really good map. So it just shows you the positions of the various companies. So there's a whole cluster at Tempe where the river emerges from the gorge, and that's where they're waiting now. And it took them basically now to get the whole of 2nd Company across. And they're starting to get this at this stage where they start to launch attack at 4:30. The 3rd Company is still crossing the river, still getting tanks across that river, actually. And they've still only got 1 platoon of infantry with them, basically.
Wow.
But they do have the benefit of the, no, not that one yet, of the mountain troops, because they're basically starting to get across the river. They have enormous job initially under Australian fire, but later that afternoon, they found a ford. They'd even brought in some poles to put bridges, put a bridge down, and they found the poles were too small, too short to even do that. They weren't well prepared for that. So, but they found a ford and got across, and they eventually joined up with the tanks for the attack on the tanks first overran A company. That's about 5 o'clock before they got through there. They started swinging around towards second battalion. Once again, 2 tanks came around the corner towards main second battalion. Anti-tank guy opened up, knocked out one, set on fire, killed the commander. The second tank got hit and pulled back, damaged. So they weren't going to do that again. They released about 15 tanks in the main attack, actually. And they only had one anti-tank left, but the New Zealanders had the crest of the Australians had bought for 2 25-pounders just behind second battalion. So as the tanks swarmed in on A company and B company of the Australians, these 25-pounders open up, and they both accounted for 2 tanks each, actually. So you see the count's building up in terms of what Valk's getting to, actually. The first guy, they hit the wagon that carried the limber that carried the ammunition, so they basically had to get out and escape. The second gun, they had to move to another position because the tank took up a hull down position and got engaged in a shell fight. But eventually, I think the crew got wounded. When the guy came back for ammunition, they just had no choice but to get out. But second battalion pretty much collapsed and did what New Zealanders did and started making them up over the hill towards Mount Ossa and escaped towards the coast. And that left then 2 troops there were actually 3 troops of artillery. There were 2 forward of 2nd, 3rd Battalion. One being pulled back because they brought over divisional cavalry as like a rear guard force, and they had 25-pounders to support them. So what the 25-pounders were doing was one troop would pull back in a position, the other guy would cover them, then they leapfrog back through each other. And still more tanks lost that way, actually. I think eventually each troop ran out of ammunition and head out towards Larissa. There's a great story here. The Australians always said that Lieutenant Colonel Lamb had ordered the guns come all to position. He was told to stop them. He pulled out his pistol and ordered them to stop. But as they said in the diary, the guns had no ammunition, so there's no point of stopping, actually. And when the F troop came through, 2 of the guns still had ammunition left, and they joined up with the divisional cavalry. But the other 2 just carried on back towards Larissa. And so then the whole attacking force started to fall in on the 2nd, 3rd Battalion, but it's getting dark now. And when the Div Cav pulled back into a covering position, they came towards one company as it was getting dark. That's got mixed up with the infantry a bit, but managed to disengage because it was getting hard to see. And then they pulled 2nd, 3rd Battalion back to the next stopping rear guard position, and the Div Cav covered them with 25-pounders providing fire too. And finally, the Div Cav pulled back to a next rear guard position behind the main block of 26th 2nd, 3rd Battalion. And it's really dark now, and a tank drives into the middle of 2nd, 3rd Battalion, and they just said, just lie down. And then they suddenly realized in the tank that there's infantry all around, and they opened up with the rifles and shot and killed the commander. So that they pulled back. And then 22nd, 3rd Battalion, they pulled back towards their transport and started low bar on their transport. But the Germans are still attacking. And now it's completely dark, and you're getting Div Cav armoured cars and Bren gun carriers mixed up with German tanks. One guy, an armoured car, thought it was the vehicle next to him was the commander's, the squadron commander's car, goes up and wraps on the side, realizes the Panzer III. Things like this going on, actually, so armoured cars overturning. But the Germans finally just pulled back at this point. It was getting too much, actually. And at this stage, they had about 22 tanks left, and they were very short of ammunition, very short of petrol. In fact, they were going around the abandoned tanks on the field, stripping ammunition out of them just to try and get some resupply. And this then leaves the position, how do they get out? And what people didn't seem to realize was the fact that further south of here is a thing called the Nasona Swamp, a big wetland that ran between the railway line and the hills. And there was only one way through it, a small ford. And some trucks got through it, some Bren gun carriers got through it. But, and see in the next slide, one of the New Zealand gun tractors got stuck and blocked the entire ford. This probably wasn't it, but they took some time to get it out and extract the gun. There's another gun tractor got stuck eventually and had to be pulled out. In fact, they were all having trouble finding the actual true path. Some of the trucks then sent forward to rescue New Zealanders, 21st Battalion, were stopping off the side of the road. I say this is a swamp, and this area is still here. You can visit it. And I got it on Google Street View, basically. The whole basically give the position on it. Now it's all farmland, really. The stream's gone, the stuff's gone, everything, actually, so. But this was probably a lifesaver for the whole escape force, the rest of the 2nd, 3rd Battalion New Zealanders, because the advanced elements get on, and just before Larissa, you'll see a sign that said roadblock. And what had happened was that the mountain troops had sent through a company of infantry to take up a position where the railway line crossed the road. And so the advanced trucks with a few carriers ran into the thing in the middle of the night. And this firefight started out. One of the Bren gun carriers launched an attack and then got hit by a mortar bomb and then got held up on a rock and disabled. They tried to attack it from the rail line, other Bren gun carriers. Eventually, the troops had to surrender to the Germans. Some got away, but not all of them. But the rest of the guys were just getting through the roadblock and starting to get moving again. And they saw this firefight ahead and thought, there's something in the blocking us. We're not going to get through Larissa. But somebody remembered from the maps that there were some roads that led off from this main road to Larissa that would take them south. So they started out, I think the Div Cab were the lead at this point, and they started working their way towards this road. And they ran into this Greek Patterson. What he was doing in the middle of the night wandering around, I don't know. But he said, I'll show you the road. And they got down to this road and they swung off down to the sort of southeast. It wasn't the best of roads. It was still quite a lot of swampy, boggy ground. A few carriers got lost. One of their armoured cars from the Div Cab to overturn. But they got to the road to Molos. And at which point the New Zealanders turned. They were basically supposed to help to Volos, where they had 2 battalions from 6th Brigade. The Australians headed back to Larissa and then back down to Fasala, where they were going to meet up. In the meantime, of course, they're still trying to evacuate the whole of 6th Brigade. That was the last one left at Serbia Pass, and Savage Force actually cleared Larissa 2 hours before the Germans got there. 6th Brigade was 2 hours before Savage Force. So they managed to extract the entire force in that time, actually. Next morning, they set off. You go to the next photograph. And this is the Panzer II coming down. This is the main road into Larissa from Tempe, basically. When they got to Larissa, all the medium tanks ran out of petrol. So they were probably smart not for the Panzer IIs to carry on. There would have been about 5 of those. They sent them on south, but about 20k south, 40k south, they ran out of petrol. So, and they tried to get petrol dropped, and the German Luftwaffe said, we're not going to drop that. You find a place for us to land. Of course, they obviously got to the airfield and brought some supplies in eventually. But they were also hoping to meet up there with Camp Kurlitz, because who were coming through from Olympus Pass. So if you go to the next slide, this is the same place today. This is just a Google Street View image again, but just gives you know how it's the only wide road actually in Larissa, but it makes perfect sense. That's what it is. But the trouble was, of course, that the New Zealanders had blown up all the bridges on the Pineios River. So the next slide, this is what's left of the Old Stone Bridge. And this is one where they packed it with explosives. They said it was such a powerful explosion that blew out windows about 20 blocks away from the actual site. Wow. It's a shame. It's a beautiful old bridge, actually. And that, you look behind, you can see the church. You can see that. And if you go to the next slide, there's actually about two 4-lane bridges across, 2 2-lane bridges, and another bridge for pedestrians across. There's the church rebuilt as well, actually. So this is a small, minor branch of the Pineios River, but the other bridge was a concrete bridge. If you go to the next slide, this one they couldn't get enough explosives to blow it. So they went to the airfield, they found a few bombs the British left behind, and they wired those up and blew it, basically. So they're quite spectacular too. But this is still not good enough, really, for the Germans, because the Camp Group Curtis breached a place called Turnavos. So go to the next slide, which is this is the cost, basically, of what they lost in terms of what they started off with. This is the theoretical start of what they had actually in terms of Panzer IIs. So 59 tanks, but they claimed 3 Panzer IIs in the river, 1 Panzer III, damaged 3 days to repair 3 of those, 12 Panzer IIIs, 2 Panzer IVs. They say KO'd Panzer IIs, 10, 3 destroyed by mines, 2. Well, there were 2 Panzer IVs destroyed by mines, but I think there was one that was probably pretty minor damage actually. So they basically, if that was what they started with at the Platamon Ridge, 59 tanks, they've lost a considerable number actually. Almost 2/3 of their tanks have gone basically. And this is why I talk about this has been like there's that famous sort of battle, the Greek,
Thermopylae.
No, it's the famous battle. It's a sort of battle where you win the battle, but you haven't won the battle, basically.
Right. Okay. They've kind of just been worn down. Yeah, they've worn down.
Yeah, exactly. They basically got the point, but they've gotten over it at all, actually. So there's no position to carry on. They've got to Larissa. They've got no petrol. They won't get that. They did find the British petrol station about midday, but it wasn't enough to keep them going really with the tanks anyway. The mountain division got to there and they said, we're having a rest day tomorrow. Sorry, we're not going to do anything actually, So no one's
Pyrrhic victory. There we go. Pyrrhic victory.
Pyrrhic victory. That's the one. Yeah. Sorry.
That's the one. Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah. That's a Pyrrhic victory. So there's no way they're going to carry on, even though they're ordered to carry on. They said 5th Panzer Division, they could carry on the attack. Well, 5th Panzer Division didn't get to the Thessaly plain at Kalabaka until that evening. So there's nobody to carry on the assault. You've got a whole day for the New Zealand division, the Australian division to get away, basically, And if you go to the next slide, this is the bridge at Turnavos, also blown. This is where Camp Group Curtis got to. They can't go. Well, they did. Well, you go to the next slide. They found a ford. So they managed to push enough, possibly a company of tanks over the river until the ford just got out of water. They're just just a quagmire, no longer usable. Go to the next slide, and you can see that quite distinctive hill. And just next to the sign, you can just see the new bridge, the repaired bridge anyway. So you've got Kangaroo Curlets held up here until the 22nd of April, So basically from the 19th to 22nd, there's 4 or 5 days where the Germans just can't do much. The 5th Panzer Division can start to move down, but, they did run into issues with 2nd Panzer. Some of the troops went down and met up with them and attacked one of the Australian rear guards near Demokos, and they got mixed up with them, and the 5th Panzer Division couldn't get going either. They had to use a road that was getting destroyed by rain. A big thunderstorm hit when they used this dirty old road, and that slowed them down. So the Anzacs are trying to repair a defensive line at Thermopylae, which also got compromised when the Greeks, Western Greek army surrendered to the Germans. So they decided they just can't defend, they have to get out. But they had 5 days to start preparing a defensive line, start to prepare and escape from Greece, really. So the last slide basically is the link up at Larissa, really. So this is one of the 5th company from Camp Curtis at the old concrete bridge, actually. So it's a Pyrrhic victory, and it just gave them time to escape, really, So, yeah.
Well, it's been brilliant stuff, and we should just show the little clip you provided as well of the tanks crossing before we finish things up, which I'll put that on now. Crazy that it's not that film. Really, really cool. It's a very short clip, folks. Yeah, that is a fast-moving river. Well, it's been absolutely brilliant stuff talking to you, Jeff. And folks, as I said at the beginning, the link to Jeff's book is in the description below. And I think most of us watching here had very little understanding of this campaign. As you say, it's not, there's no big conclusion to it in a sense. It's, they've delayed it. There's a pullout. It's a really intriguing example of how the terrain can just drain away your resources. No major actions, but just this attritional campaign of maneuver. And yeah, it's been fascinating talking to you. I can't wait to have you back.
Yeah, I'd love to come back sometime. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, folks, that's it for me today. Tomorrow we're talking about alcohol and its relationship with the US Army in World War II. But in the meantime, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I'm going to say enjoy the rest of your day. This is Paul Woodedge saying cheers very much. Bye.
Bye.